All right, so just kind of continue. So as I said, my grandpa confused me a lot. He never really explained things very well, but I'll kind of like just give a little bit more idea of what his teachings are. So like his idea was, you don't want to be a good person. You want to be a beneficial presence, because like a good person, again, the person, my grandpa would say, the self is the problem. So like now I understand it. At the time he didn't explain it well, but now like really it's based off my own understanding of what he taught. But like if you're a good person, for instance, I might, because I see myself as Jewish, let's say, right? Then I'm like, okay, well, giving to the poor is good, but do I have ulterior motives? I'm a good person, right? I'm giving to the poor, or do I really want to do that because I want to give to people of color so that I can defeat the white people? So I might have an ego agenda or a bias, and I might not really be in the flow. In the flow, my grandpa would say that's completely objective, or like, I might believe in Darwinism because I was against Christianity. I'm against religion, or, I have ego biases, but so then I attach myself to these beliefs based off around my ego. So I'm a good, I think I'm a good person. I think, but I haven't transcended the self. I haven't transcended the person, the separate person. So my grandpa, I think, based off of all the study I did, but he never really taught me that well because I never really understood. But, once you transcend the person, you transcend the self. Now you're in the flow, and now you can see more objectively. You can see the truth. You could see what my grandpa called pure awareness. But again, I was always confused because when he would talk about like pure awareness, I'm like, okay, is that some sort of hippie thing? Is that like everybody should race mix? Like, the flow, pure awareness. Oh, is that like everybody should race mix? Is that like, transcend dualistic software, dualistic consciousness? What does that even mean? I'm like, okay, does that mean everyone should race mix? Does that mean everyone should be communist? Or like, what are you talking about? But now I understand what he's saying is the illusion that you are a separate self. And then once you transcend the separate self, now you can see the truth. And pure awareness isn't like a hippie, like, oh, I'm just like, everything is beautiful. It's like to see things as they really are, right? So I kind of understand that now, and then kind of go back into like my relationship with Chris and stuff. Like I like to drive around with her because like, again, I would be able to do things I wouldn't normally do. Usually I would just study Internet Archive books, right? Because I thought the Internet Archive was going down and I wanted to get as many books as possible. But then when I'm with Chris, it gave me an excuse. Okay, well, I'll drive with her and we'll listen to lectures on the MBTI and stuff. And I could learn something that I normally wouldn't learn. So it would give me an excuse to do that. But my point is, so my grandpa just kind of confused me. But at this point, this was, after the miscarriage or whatever with Chris, I was starting to understand my grandpa a little bit more because he started teaching me more, and I started to kind of understand what he's trying to teach. But again, he still confused me. So, I remember I was, I was still a little bit confused, but I was starting to understand it more. Like the stuff that I'm understanding now, I wouldn't have understood then. Like I asked my grandpa, like, okay, why is it that, you want to be spontaneous? Why is it that, like, if you're in the flow, you're not attached to money, right? He'd say you're not attached to money. And he would say, well, money's not bad because, right, if being against money, that could be an ego thing, right? Because let's say I see myself as Jewish and, I want to be against money because I want to be against the white people because I want communism, right? So, being against money might be an ego thing. It might not be the flow, right? But my grandpa would say it's not money, but it's a love of money. But being attached, if you're attached to anything, then you can't be in the flow, because when you're in the flow, it's inspiration and you're not attached to any outcome, and you are motivated, or you're moving toward what is perfect or what is the truth, right? Now, the question is there really a perfect, or is there really a truth, or is my grandpa full of shit? My grandpa would even admit, like, I could be full of shit, and he would say he is full of shit because he's full of what he would say memorized ideas, as opposed to the flow, as opposed to pure inspiration, which would be a higher level of consciousness. But again, my grandpa confused me because, he tried to make everything so rational. Like, he'd be like, well, there is no God, or, I think that inspiration is really just, the synergy of the different ideas that you have, and they come together and they produce something greater than expected. And so it's not something coming from something higher, like a divine consciousness. My grandpa was more like everything's energy. So it was like more mundane, and he tried to be too rationalistic. But that's not even what Dr. Hora taught. Dr. Hora was very new age, and he's like, no, you're creating your reality. But my grandpa tried to make everything not rationalistic. And that was my grandpa's teacher, was Dr. Hora. My grandpa would be like, well, you don't necessarily create the reality, but, you're not creating the storm. You're not creating your sickness necessarily, but you make yourself more receptive to it, or you choose to experience the storm or not, but you don't necessarily create it. But again, my grandpa would be kind of like that. He would sometimes go to New Age and be like, well, you can create it because you can manipulate the energy, but that's not magical thinking. My grandpa would be against magical thinking. And he admitted, like, I was like, well, don't you think Dr. Hora's teachings are magical thinking, that you create the storm? And he'd be like, well, maybe, but, my grandpa tried to be against magical thinking. But again, my grandpa confused me because he I started reading Dr. Horace, so I started understanding where my grandpa's kind of getting his ideas of take responsibility. But my grandpa tried to, water down all Dr. Horace teachings and make it very rationalistic. And again, maybe because he didn't want me to make fun of him, maybe, I don't know. But he tried to make things so rationalistic, and that's not even what Dr. Horace taught. So he's just confusing me. So Dr. Horace would be like, you're creating the storm. And my grandpa would be like, we don't necessarily create the storm, but you can choose to experience it or not. And, you could choose to get involved in the drama, which is, self-confirmatory, or, you can, maybe you can sort of create the storm in that, everything's energy and you can manipulate the energies, but I doubt it though, because I'm trying to be rationalistic. But, so my grandpa's just confusing me. But, my grandpa's whole thing was like, yeah, he tried to, he'd be like, no, there is no magic. It's not magical thinking, no magical thinking. Like, you don't create, like in the book, the movie The Secret, the guy's like, yeah, he created the parking spot with his thoughts. And that's kind of more what Dr. Horace would think. Dr. Horace is very new age. That was my grandpa's teacher. My grandpa would be like, well, you don't necessarily create the parking spot, but, by having positive thinking or optimistic thinking, you can make yourself more receptive to it by, trying harder to find it. And or like, like in the movie The Secret, they'd be like, well, you can create this, you can imagine, with your thoughts, you can manifest this house, this mansion. And this guy's like, yes, I manifested the mansion with my thoughts. And my grandpa would be like, that's what Dr. Horace would teach. Dr. Horace was very new age, but my grandpa would be like, well, it's not necessarily that you create the house, but, you increase he tried to make everything rationalistic. You increase your level of aliveness, and that will make you work harder, and then you can make more possible. So you don't, make it happen, but you create more of a possibility for it to happen by having the optimistic thinking, which raises your level of aliveness, which raises your AQ, so my grandpa would like use the new age stuff, but he would water it down. And, and Dr. Horace's new age stuff was, yeah, take responsibility for everything because you're creating everything. But my grandpa would be like, well, you're not necessarily creating everything, because he tried to make everything rationalistic, maybe because he didn't want to make fun of him. I don't know, but he'd be like, you don't necessarily create it, but it is best to take responsibility for everything, and, to really just responsibility for upgrading your software, and, that's the most beneficial way to be, but again, like, I would question that. Is it really, And I think my grandpa would even admit that in the flow, there is no formula. So, like, sometimes it would be beneficial to acknowledge when not to take responsibility, because it might be too much to take responsibility. But my grandpa would be like, well, you don't blame yourself, but you're blaming your software. You're not blaming but you're taking responsibility for your software and be able to upgrade your software to the, to pure awareness, to the flow. So, like, again, an example of that would be like, in terms of like giving to the poor, my grandpa would be like, okay, so this is another example. Like, so I remember I was talking to my grandpa, and my grandpa's, again, I always saw my grandpa, when I started listening to these lectures, and I listened to this on Internet Archive, or listening to these audiobooks, and this one guy was talking about a lot of these psychiatrists, like Fritz Perls, who he said were just like human potential people. And I was like, yeah, that's what my grandpa is, because my grandpa really liked Fritz Perls. And Fritz Perls' whole thing is like, yes, just be in the moment. You don't need to talk about the past. Just be in the moment and just go all out and, work hard, and, you don't need, and my grandpa liked that, but so, like, so I asked my grandpa, like, well, grandpa, give me an example. Like, why are you so into this idea of like, don't make excuses and just be in the moment? And my grandpa would be like, well, I'd be like, can you give me an example of something like that? My grandpa would be like, well, Martin Luther King. Because again, like, I feel like my grandpa's full of shit. And I'm like, he always he tries to like, say things that the society would like instead of just like owning up to what Dr. Horace taught, like, yes, you create your reality. He tries to like conform to society, who would be in society would be more prone to be like, yeah, well, that's crazy, but yeah, of course you can make things more possible by having a high level of aliveness and optimism and stuff. And but in this case, like, my grandpa would be like, yeah, well, Martin Luther King, he's an example, because again, like, society's like, yeah, Martin Luther King, of course, that's a perfect example. So he's like, yeah, Martin Luther King didn't make excuses. He had, he, quote unquote, he was considered black, and he had, but he didn't make excuses, and he just went all out, and he didn't make excuses. And that's a human potential movement. And like, and he was like, and another example would be like you, because I told my grandpa how I fixed my shot when I was playing with Compton College, and I was, I wish I had more basketball videos so I can fix it better. But, I started to figure things out. My grandpa's like, well, you didn't make excuses. But in my mind, I'm like, dude, I did fucking make excuses. yes, if I had help with my mom and dad to help me get basketball videos, if I had help, instead of like being treated bad and stuff, I could have probably done better in a lot of ways, or but again, like in the same way, I'm like, well, you know what, maybe this is the way that God wanted it. This is, it's the best, but my grandpa would be like, we didn't make excuses, but I'm like, dude, really, all you are is a victim blamer and a winner extoller. Because I'm like, basically, if someone is considered good by society and a winner, you're like, well, he didn't make excuses. How the fuck do you know he didn't make excuses? And how do you know that not making excuses is necessarily even the best way to go? But it's like, so, but my grandpa's whole thing is like, yeah, just work hard, just go all out, just don't make excuses, just, don't, and of course, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, if you're making excuses and stuff, yeah, a lot of that's based off the ego, and people do that, like, people like, that's why, some people say people do drugs so they can have an excuse. They'd be like, well, it would be so great if I didn't just do these drugs. And yeah, my grandpa would be like, yeah, that's dualistic software. It's ego, calculative thinking, motivate. They're not in the flow. So they do the drugs, and then that's their excuse. They're like, well, I would have been so great if I wouldn't have just done the drugs. So they intentionally handicap themselves, right? But my point is, like, my grandpa would be like, well, just don't make excuses. Just go all out. Just, transcend the ego, go all out, so you're not involved in the dualistic, ego, manipulative, calculative thinking and doing and all that. So you could be in the flow. So I understand that, but it's like at the same time, I asked my grandpa, I was like, well, grandpa, how the fuck do you even know that Martin Luther King did what was best? Again, even my grandpa admits in the flow, there is no formula, and you don't even know if what he did was necessary. As my grandpa says, Paul said, this is what Dr. Horace said, Paul said, the good I would, I do not. That which I would not, I end up doing. So people can try to do good. That's what my grandpa says. The good the person tries to do good, but you don't want to be a good person. You want to be a beneficial presence. You try to do good, but you end up doing bad. I'm like, how do you know that Martin Luther King did good? How do you know that it wouldn't have been? And my grandpa's like, well, I have to admit, I don't know. But, my grandpa would be like, but he does think that cooperation is a step toward the flow, because when you cooperate, at least you're moving toward the group and getting along, which is, a step outside of the self, which is a step toward the flow. But even my grandpa would admit cooperation is not necessarily the flow, because it's still based around the illusion that they're separate individual selves, and the illusion of the self. And the self is what prevents you, the self, the body, the ego is what prevents you from the truth, the flow, right? So, but anyways, but I started to, at this point, after the abortion or miscarriage with Chris, I started to kind of understand this stuff a little bit more, right? So I started to be like, okay, I'm starting to get it a little bit more. But at the same time, so I'll kind of continue in the next lecture. But yeah, I'll continue in the next lecture.